Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent weekends at the mall, she was out in the desert with her grandfather, learning to shoot tin cans off fence posts with his old hunting rifle. Her grandfather, a World War II veteran, had taught her that shooting wasn't about aggression or showing off. It was about discipline, patience, and respect for the weapon in your hands. When Sarah announced at 18 that she was joining the Marines, her family wasn't surprised. Her mother worried, of course, but her father understood. Sarah had the kind of quiet determination that couldn't be contained by small-town expectations. She wanted to serve her country, and more than that, she wanted to prove that a girl from nowhere could stand alongside the toughest soldiers in the world. Boot camp at Paris Island was everything Sarah had expected and more. The drill instructors were relentless, the physical training was brutal, and the mental pressure was constant. But Sarah thrived in the structured environment. She woke up before reveille, stayed after lights out to clean her gear, and never complained about the endless push-ups and runs through the South Carolina heat. The other recruits noticed her dedication, though not all of them appreciated it. Some of the male recruits, particularly a group led by a cocky kid from New York named Danny Rodriguez, seemed to take her presence as a personal challenge. They made snide comments about women in combat roles, questioned whether she belonged there, and constantly tried to undermine her confidence. Sarah ignored most of it. She had learned from her grandfather that action spoke louder than words, and she was determined to let her performance do the talking. She excelled in every area of training except one that would prove to be crucial: marksmanship. Not because she couldn't shoot, but because her rifle kept malfunctioning at the worst possible times. The first incident happened during their initial rifle familiarization. Sarah had been looking forward to this day for weeks. She knew she was a good shot, probably better than most of the recruits in her platoon. But when she squeezed the trigger on her assigned M16A4, nothing happened. The rifle had jammed. Her drill instructor, Staff Sergeant Williams, made her field strip and reassemble the weapon while the rest of the platoon watched. Sarah didn't think much of it at first. Rifles jam sometimes, especially older training weapons that have been used by thousands of recruits. But then it happened again during their first qualification attempt, and again during the following week's training session. Each time, Sarah would have to stop, clear the jam, and start over while her scores suffered and her frustration mounted. The drill instructors began to take notice, but not in a good way. Staff Sergeant Williams started making pointed comments about recruits who couldn't maintain their weapons properly. He questioned whether Sarah was cleaning her rifle correctly, whether she was loading the magazines properly, whether she had the mechanical aptitude to handle military equipment. Sarah knew she was doing everything right. She had grown up around firearms and understood them better than most recruits who had never held a gun before joining the Marines. She cleaned her rifle meticulously, checked every component, and followed every procedure exactly as taught. Yet the jams continued to happen, always during critical moments when her performance was being evaluated. The other recruits began to whisper. Some genuinely felt sorry for Sarah and offered to help her troubleshoot her weapon. Others, particularly Rodriguez's group, saw her struggles as confirmation of their beliefs about women in the military. They started calling her Jam Girl behind her back, making jokes about how she couldn't handle a man's weapon. Sarah's shooting scores remained mediocre, not because of her marksmanship skills, but because she spent half her time on the firing line dealing with mechanical problems. She watched in frustration as recruits who had never fired a gun before boot camp posted better scores than her simply because their rifles functioned properly. The situation came to a head during a particularly important qualification round. Sarah had been practicing extra hours in dry fire drills, perfecting her sight alignment and trigger control in her spare time. She felt confident and ready. This was her chance to prove herself and silence the doubters. As she settled into position on the 500-yard line, Sarah felt a familiar calm wash over her. This was the distance where her grandfather had taught her to shoot, where she had spent countless hours as a teenager perfecting her technique. The targets looked tiny through her rifle's iron sights, but Sarah had made this shot hundreds of times before. She controlled her breathing, found her natural point of aim, and slowly squeezed the trigger. The familiar click of a misfire echoed in her ears, instead of the crack of a round leaving the barrel. Another jam, at the worst possible moment. As Sarah began the familiar routine of clearing her weapon, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Rodriguez was positioned 3 spots down from her, and she caught him quickly looking away from her rifle with a smirk on his face. In that moment, Sarah realized that her mechanical problems might not be random after all. The thought hit her like a physical blow. Had someone been sabotaging her rifle? The idea seemed almost too outrageous to believe, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. The jams always happened during evaluations, never during practice, when the drill instructors weren't paying close attention. The problems were always just serious enough to disrupt her shooting, but not so obvious that they would be immediately identified as sabotage. Sarah finished the qualification round with another disappointing score. As she cleaned her rifle afterward, she examined every component with new eyes, looking for signs of tampering. She couldn't find anything obvious, but she knew that someone with knowledge of firearms could cause malfunctions in subtle ways that would be hard to detect. That night, Sarah lay in her bunk thinking about her situation. She was falling behind in one of the most important aspects of Marine training, and her reputation was suffering. The drill instructors were starting to question her competence, and some of her fellow recruits saw her as a liability. She knew she had 2 choices. She could report her suspicions and hope someone would investigate, or she could find a way to prove herself despite the sabotage. Sarah had never been one to make excuses or ask for special treatment. Her grandfather had taught her that life wasn't fair, but that didn't mean you gave up when things got tough. She decided that if someone was trying to make her fail, she would have to succeed in spite of them. But first, she needed to understand exactly what was being done to her rifle and figure out how to stop it. The next few days became a chess match that only Sarah fully understood. She began varying her routine, arriving at the armory at different times, keeping her rifle with her longer than necessary, and watching carefully for anyone who showed unusual interest in her weapon. She also started studying her rifle more closely, memorizing every scratch and wear mark so she could detect if anything had been changed. Her vigilance paid off when she caught Rodriguez's friend, a recruit named Mike Chen, lingering near her rifle during a break in training. Chen claimed he was just curious about her weapon's serial number, but Sarah noticed he seemed nervous and avoided eye contact. She didn't confront him directly, but she filed the information away and continued her careful observation. Sarah also began reaching out to other female recruits and Marines she met around the base, asking subtle questions about their experiences with equipment problems. What she learned disturbed her. Several women reported similar patterns of rifle malfunctions, always during important evaluations. Always just subtle enough to seem like bad luck rather than sabotage. The picture that emerged was of a deliberate campaign to undermine female Marines' shooting scores and, by extension, their confidence and credibility. It wasn't organized or official, just a handful of recruits and possibly some junior Marines who thought they were defending their traditional male space by making women fail. Sarah felt a cold anger building inside her, but she channeled it into determination rather than rage. She had always known that proving herself as a woman in the military would be challenging, but she had expected the challenges to come from the official training and evaluation process, not from deliberate sabotage by her own fellow Marines. As the weeks passed, Sarah's shooting scores remained inconsistent, but she began to develop strategies for dealing with the sabotage. She learned to field strip and reassemble her rifle faster than anyone else in her platoon. She practiced malfunction clearances until she could perform them in her sleep. Most importantly, she started bringing backup ammunition and equipment to the range, preparing for every possible scenario. The other recruits began to notice Sarah's extra preparations, but they interpreted them as signs of her mechanical incompetence rather than evidence of her growing tactical thinking. Rodriguez and his friends continued their subtle harassment, confident that they were successfully undermining her career before it even began. What they didn't realize was that Sarah was learning far more than just marksmanship on the firing line. She was developing the kind of mental toughness and adaptability that would serve her well in actual combat situations. Every jam she cleared, every malfunction she overcame, was making her a better Marine even as it hurt her official scores. Sarah also began to understand the deeper dynamics at play in her unit. She identified which recruits and instructors supported her, which ones were actively working against her, and which ones were simply indifferent. This knowledge would prove crucial in the weeks to come as she prepared to turn the tables on those who had tried to sabotage her success. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just Sarah's future in the Marines, but also send a message about what happened to those who tried to undermine their fellow soldiers. Sarah had been underestimated and dismissed, but she was about to show everyone exactly what she was capable of when the gloves came off. Sarah's breakthrough came during an unexpected moment of carelessness by her saboteurs. She had developed the habit of arriving at the armory early each morning, ostensibly to perform extra maintenance on her rifle, but actually to observe who else showed unusual interest in the weapon's storage area. On a humid Thursday morning, she witnessed something that confirmed her worst suspicions and gave her the evidence she needed. Rodriguez and Chen were having a quiet conversation near the rifle racks, thinking they were alone. Sarah had positioned herself behind a concrete pillar where she could observe without being seen. She watched as Chen demonstrated something to Rodriguez using hand gestures that mimicked disassembling a rifle's bolt carrier group. Then Rodriguez nodded and made a motion that looked like he was explaining how to subtly damage a gas ring or firing pin. Sarah's military training kicked in as she carefully memorized every detail of what she witnessed. She noted the time, the location, and the specific actions she observed. More importantly, she realized that her suspicions about systematic sabotage were not just paranoia, but documented reality. That afternoon during rifle maintenance, Sarah paid extra attention to her weapon's internals. Using the small inspection mirror from her cleaning kit, she discovered what she had been looking for. Tiny scratches on her bolt carrier that hadn't been there the previous day. The scratches were in exactly the locations that would cause feeding problems and misfires, but they were subtle enough that most people would assume they were normal wear and tear. The discovery filled Sarah with a mixture of rage and cold satisfaction. She finally had proof of what was happening, but more importantly, she now understood exactly how it was being done. Armed with this knowledge, she could take steps to protect her equipment and plan her response. Sarah's first move was to secure her rifle from further tampering. She began keeping her weapon with her at all times when possible, even carrying it to the mess hall and other locations where it wasn't strictly required. When she had to store it in the armory, she used a technique her grandfather had taught her for detecting tampering. She placed tiny pieces of clear tape in specific locations on her rifle that would be disturbed if someone disassembled it. The tape trick worked exactly as expected. Several times over the following week, Sarah discovered that her rifle had been handled while she was away. But now she was prepared for the sabotage attempts. She began carrying backup firing pins, gas rings, and other critical components that could be quickly damaged or removed. She also started coating certain internal parts with a thin layer of grease that would show fingerprints if anyone touched them. More importantly, Sarah began building her own evidence file. She photographed the tampering evidence, documented dates and times of suspicious activity, and started keeping detailed notes about her rifle's condition before and after each training session. She also began discreetly talking to other female Marines and recruits, gathering information about their similar experiences. What Sarah discovered shocked her. The sabotage wasn't limited to her rifle or even her training platoon. At least 6 other women across different companies had experienced similar patterns of equipment failures during critical evaluations. Some had been dropped from advanced training programs because of poor marksmanship scores caused by malfunctioning weapons. Others had been reassigned to non-combat roles after being labeled as mechanically incompetent. The scope of the problem made Sarah realize that this wasn't just a few recruits playing pranks. There was a systematic effort to push women out of combat roles by undermining their performance in subtle ways that were hard to prove or prosecute. The perpetrators were counting on their victims being too embarrassed or uncertain to report the sabotage, and their strategy was working. Sarah faced a difficult decision. She could report what she had discovered to the chain of command and hope for an investigation, but she knew that proving deliberate sabotage would be difficult without catching someone in the act. The perpetrators had been careful to leave minimal evidence, and military investigations could take months while her career suffered. Alternatively, she could handle the situation herself by exposing the saboteurs in a way that would be impossible to ignore or deny. This option was riskier because it could be seen as taking matters into her own hands rather than following proper channels. But it also offered the possibility of a more immediate and decisive resolution. Sarah chose a third path that combined elements of both approaches. She would continue gathering evidence and documenting the sabotage, but she would also prepare for a public demonstration that would expose the truth and prove her actual capabilities. The key was finding the right moment and venue for maximum impact. Her opportunity came when the base announced an upcoming marksmanship competition open to all Marines and recruits. The event would feature multiple shooting disciplines at various distances, and participation was voluntary but highly encouraged. The winners would receive recognition at a ceremony attended by senior officers, and their scores would be noted in their permanent records. Sarah saw this competition as her chance to level the playing field. Unlike regular training exercises where her rifle could be sabotaged beforehand, the competition would use weapons selected randomly on the day of the event. Competitors would not have access to their assigned rifles until moments before shooting began, making sabotage nearly impossible. She began preparing for the competition with an intensity that surprised even herself. Sarah spent every available moment practicing dry-fire exercises to perfect her trigger control and sight alignment. She studied wind patterns on the base's rifle range, memorized the ballistic characteristics of standard military ammunition, and even researched the maintenance records of the rifles likely to be used in the competition. Her grandfather had always told her that preparation was the foundation of good shooting, and Sarah took that lesson to heart. She practiced shooting positions until she could assume a stable firing stance in seconds. She worked on her breathing techniques until she could control her heart rate and steady her aim even under pressure. Most importantly, she studied the competition format and rules until she understood every aspect of what would be required. The other recruits noticed Sarah's increased focus on marksmanship training, but they interpreted it differently based on their existing opinions of her abilities. Rodriguez and his friends saw it as a desperate attempt by someone who couldn't shoot well to somehow improve through extra practice. They made jokes about her spending so much time on the range when she should be focusing on other aspects of Marine training where she might actually succeed. The recruits who supported Sarah saw her extra training as admirable dedication, but even they weren't optimistic about her chances in the competition. Her official scores had been consistently mediocre, and she would be competing against some of the best marksmen on the base, including instructors and senior Marines with years of experience. Sarah didn't try to change anyone's expectations. She preferred to let her preparations speak for themselves when the time came. She also continued her investigation into the sabotage network, identifying several more perpetrators and documenting their methods in careful detail. One of her most important discoveries was that the sabotage wasn't random or purely malicious. There was a clear pattern targeting women who showed promise in combat roles, or who were competing for limited slots in specialized training programs. The perpetrators saw themselves as protecting standards and preserving opportunities for male Marines, but they were actually undermining military readiness by pushing out potentially excellent soldiers. As the competition date approached, Sarah made her final preparations. She had backup plans for every possible scenario, from equipment malfunctions to adverse weather conditions. She had studied the backgrounds and shooting styles of her likely competitors, identifying their strengths and weaknesses. Most importantly, she had mentally prepared herself for the pressure of public performance after months of private struggle. The night before the competition, Sarah lay in her bunk thinking about everything that had led to this moment. She thought about her grandfather and the lessons he had taught her about perseverance and dignity. She thought about the other women who had been pushed out of the Marines because of sabotage they couldn't prove or overcome. She thought about the career she wanted and the service she hoped to give to her country. Sarah also thought about Rodriguez, Chen, and the others who had tried to destroy her confidence and derail her military career. She felt no personal animosity toward them, but she was determined to show them and everyone else that their actions had failed. She was going to compete not just for herself, but for every woman who had been told she didn't belong in combat roles. The competition would be more than just a shooting match. It would be Sarah's declaration that she belonged in the Marines and that no amount of sabotage or harassment could change that fact. She had been tested in ways that went far beyond standard military training, and she had emerged stronger and more determined than ever. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah felt a calm confidence that had been absent for months. Tomorrow, she would finally get to show everyone what she was truly capable of when the playing field was level. The Marines who had tried to sabotage her were about to learn that they had picked the wrong target. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just Sarah's true shooting abilities, but also the systematic sabotage that had been undermining women throughout the base. Sarah had turned her period of struggle into preparation, and now she was ready to turn the tables on those who had tried to destroy her career before it even began. The morning of the marksmanship competition dawned clear and windless, perfect conditions for precision shooting. Sarah woke before reveille as had become her habit, but instead of the anxiety that had plagued her for months, she felt a deep sense of readiness. Today would either vindicate all her suspicions and training or confirm what her saboteurs had been trying to prove all along. The competition was organized as a progressive elimination tournament, with multiple stages. The first round would be basic marksmanship at 200 yards, designed to weed out casual participants and establish baseline scores. Subsequent rounds would test shooting at longer distances, with moving targets and under time pressure. The final round would be reserved for the top 10 competitors shooting at 600 yards in challenging conditions. Over 400 Marines had signed up for the competition, ranging from fresh recruits like Sarah to seasoned gunnery sergeants with decades of experience. The sheer size of the event meant that it had attracted attention from base commanders and would be closely watched by senior leadership. Word had spread throughout the base that this was going to be a serious test of marksmanship skills. Sarah arrived at the competition staging area early, as was her habit, but this time she wasn't alone. Several of the women she had spoken to during her investigation had also entered the competition. They hadn't discussed their individual experiences directly, but there was an unspoken understanding among them that this event represented something larger than just a shooting contest. The competition officials had taken elaborate precautions to ensure fairness. All rifles were identical M16A4 service weapons that had been inspected and test-fired that morning. Ammunition was distributed randomly, and competitors received their assigned weapons only minutes before their scheduled firing time. These measures were designed to prevent any possibility of equipment tampering or unfair advantage. Rodriguez and his friends had also entered the competition, confident that they would easily outperform Sarah and the other women participants. They made no effort to hide their amusement at seeing Sarah among the competitors, making loud jokes about how she would probably blame another rifle malfunction when she shot poorly. The first round began with competitors divided into groups of 20, each group assigned to a different section of the firing line. Sarah found herself in the third group, scheduled to shoot after watching two previous groups establish the standard of performance. She used this time to study wind conditions, observe how the standard ammunition was performing, and mentally prepare for her turn. When Sarah's group was called to the firing line, she noticed that Rodriguez was positioned just 3 lanes away from her. Their proximity was pure coincidence, but Sarah saw it as an opportunity to send a clear message. She had spent months being undermined and doubted, and now she had a chance to demonstrate her true capabilities under conditions where sabotage was impossible. The range commands echoed across the firing line as competitors prepared for the first stage of shooting. Sarah settled into her prone position, feeling the familiar comfort of a stable shooting stance. The rifle felt different in her hands than the sabotaged weapon she had been struggling with for months. This rifle was properly zeroed, mechanically sound, and ready to perform exactly as designed. As Sarah aligned her sights on the distant target, she felt all the tension and frustration of the previous months drain away. This was what shooting was supposed to feel like. This was the skill her grandfather had taught her, the talent that had been hidden by months of deliberate equipment failures and mechanical sabotage. The command to commence firing rang out across the range. Sarah controlled her breathing, found her natural point of aim, and squeezed the trigger with the smooth, consistent pressure she had practiced thousands of times. The rifle fired exactly as it should, and through her scope, Sarah could see the bullet hole appear in the center of her target. She fired 19 more rounds in the allocated time, each shot feeling effortless and natural. When the ceasefire command was given, Sarah knew she had shot well, but she had no idea how well compared to the other competitors. The targets were taken down range for scoring while competitors waited in anxious silence. When the scores were announced, Sarah's name was called out as the highest scorer in her group, with a near-perfect score that would have been impressive for a seasoned Marine, let alone a recruit still in training. The announcement was met with stunned silence from most observers, followed by scattered applause and confused murmuring. Rodriguez and his friends stared at Sarah in obvious shock. They had spent months watching her struggle with basic marksmanship, and now she had just demonstrated shooting skills that exceeded their own. The cognitive dissonance was visible on their faces as they tried to reconcile what they had just witnessed with their assumptions about her abilities. Sarah felt a surge of quiet satisfaction but maintained her composure. This was only the first round, and she needed to sustain her performance through increasingly difficult challenges. She also knew that her unexpectedly strong showing would likely prompt her saboteurs to look for other ways to undermine her performance in future rounds. The second round featured shooting at 300 yards with a time limit that added pressure and required faster target acquisition. Sarah approached this stage with growing confidence, knowing that her rifle would perform consistently and that her months of extra practice were paying off. She had always been good at shooting under pressure, and the time constraint actually helped her by preventing overthinking. Once again, Sarah's performance was exceptional. Her scores were consistently in the top tier of all competitors, male or female, experienced or recruit. By the end of the second round, word had spread throughout the base about the recruit who was shooting like a seasoned sniper. Senior officers who hadn't planned to attend the competition began showing up to observe the later rounds. The third round eliminated all but 50 competitors, and Sarah was safely among them. More importantly, she was now ahead of Rodriguez and most of his friends in the overall standings. Their earlier confidence had been replaced by obvious frustration and confused anger as they tried to understand how someone they had considered incompetent was outperforming them. During the break between rounds, several senior Marines approached Sarah to congratulate her shooting and ask about her background. She politely answered their questions, while carefully observing the reactions of Rodriguez and the others she suspected of sabotage. Their body language and whispered conversations suggested that they were beginning to realize the implications of her performance. The fourth round tested competitors' ability to engage multiple targets at varying distances, simulating combat scenarios where rapid target transitions and range estimation were critical. This was the type of shooting that separated natural marksmen from those who had simply memorized range procedures, and it played directly to Sarah's strengths. Sarah had grown up hunting in terrain where quick shots at varying distances were necessary, and her grandfather had taught her to estimate range and adjust her aim instinctively. The skills that had been suppressed by months of equipment problems now emerged in full force, and she dominated this round even more convincingly than the previous ones. By the end of the fourth round, Sarah was among the top 10 competitors overall, and the only woman to make it to the final elimination round. Her performance had attracted the attention of base commanders and senior training staff, who were beginning to ask questions about why such an obviously talented marksman had been posting mediocre scores in regular training exercises. The questions from senior leadership were exactly what Sarah had hoped to achieve. She had documented evidence of the sabotage and a list of witnesses who could corroborate similar experiences by other women. But more importantly, she had demonstrated that the performance problems weren't due to lack of skill or mechanical incompetence as her saboteurs had claimed. As preparations began for the final round, Sarah noticed increased agitation among Rodriguez and his group. They were having intense whispered conversations and casting frequent glances in her direction. She suspected they were trying to figure out how to explain her sudden improvement without admitting to their sabotage activities. The final round would be the ultimate test: 600-yard shots in variable wind conditions with only 10 rounds allowed, and points deducted for misses. This was precision shooting at its most demanding, requiring perfect technique, equipment knowledge, and mental discipline. It was also the type of shooting where experience and training typically showed the greatest advantage. Sarah had one significant advantage that none of her competitors knew about. She had been shooting at 600 yards since she was a teenager. Her grandfather's property included a long valley where they had set up targets at extreme distances for practice. She had probably fired more rounds at 600 yards than most of the Marines in the competition, despite her youth and limited military experience. As the 10 finalists prepared for the decisive round, Sarah felt the same calm focus that had carried her through months of sabotage and struggle. She had already proven her point and exposed the truth about her abilities. Now she had a chance to demonstrate just how wrong her saboteurs had been about women in combat roles. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine not just the winner of a shooting competition, but also the fate of those who had tried to undermine Sarah's military career. She had turned months of deliberate sabotage into intensive training, and now she was ready to show everyone exactly what she was capable of when given a fair chance to compete. The 10 finalists gathered at the 600-yard line as word of the final round spread throughout the base. What had started as a routine marksmanship competition had evolved into something much more significant. Senior officers, drill instructors, and Marines from across the base had assembled to witness what many were calling the most impressive shooting display by a recruit in recent memory. Sarah surveyed her competition as they prepared for the final challenge. Among the finalists were two gunnery sergeants with over 15 years of experience each, a scout sniper instructor, several staff sergeants with combat deployments, and Rodriguez, who had managed to shoot well enough to reach the final round despite his obvious emotional turmoil over Sarah's performance. The wind conditions had deteriorated since the morning, with variable gusts coming from multiple directions that would test every competitor's ability to read environmental conditions and adjust their aim accordingly. The targets at 600 yards looked impossibly small, and the margin for error was virtually non-existent. Competition officials announced that each finalist would fire 10 rounds in sequence with no time limit, allowing for careful aim and wind reading between shots. Scoring would be based on total points, with the X-ring worth maximum value and points decreasing for hits in outer rings. Misses would result in 0 points, making accuracy more important than speed. Sarah was scheduled to shoot 5th in the sequence, which gave her time to observe wind patterns and see how the earlier shooter's bullets were being affected by the changing conditions. She watched carefully as the first 4 competitors took their turns, noting how the wind was pushing bullets and trying to detect patterns in the gusts. The first shooter, one of the gunnery sergeants, posted a respectable score that demonstrated his experience but also showed the difficulty of the conditions. The second shooter, the scout sniper instructor, performed better but still struggled with several shots that were pulled off target by unexpected wind changes. The third and fourth shooters both had mixed results, with good shots interspersed with clear misses. When Sarah's turn came, a hush fell over the crowd of observers. Many had heard about her performance in the earlier rounds, but this was their first chance to see the recruit who was outperforming seasoned Marines. She could feel hundreds of eyes watching as she settled into her shooting position and began her pre-shot routine. Sarah's approach to the 600-yard challenge was methodical and deliberate. She spent several minutes studying wind indicators and feeling the air currents on her face before firing her first shot. When she finally squeezed the trigger, the bullet struck the X-ring with a precision that drew murmurs of approval from the crowd. Her second shot was equally precise, followed by a third that was only slightly off-center. By her fourth shot, it was clear to experienced observers that they were witnessing something exceptional. Sarah was reading the wind conditions better than Marines with years more experience, and her shooting technique was textbook perfect. The crowd grew quieter with each successive shot as Sarah continued to place bullets in, or very near, the X-ring. Her shooting rhythm was consistent and unhurried, with long pauses between shots as she waited for favorable wind conditions. When she fired her 10th and final round, the result was another center hit that completed what many observers later described as one of the finest displays of marksmanship they had ever witnessed. Sarah's preliminary score was announced as she left the firing line, 90-6 out of a possible 100 points, with 8 shots in the X-ring and 2 others just outside center. The score was not just excellent for a recruit, it was competitive with the best Marine snipers and would have been impressive for anyone regardless of experience level. Rodriguez was scheduled to shoot 7th, and the pressure of following Sarah's performance was clearly affecting him. He had been confident about his shooting abilities before the competition began, but watching Sarah dominate every round had shaken his composure. His shots were hurried and poorly placed, resulting in a score that was respectable but far below Sarah's level. The remaining shooters struggled to match Sarah's performance, though several posted good scores that would have been competitive in any other competition. When the final tallies were completed, Sarah had won the overall competition by a margin that left no doubt about her superiority, not just among the finalists, but among all 400 original competitors. The award ceremony was attended by the base commanding officer and senior staff, who had come to see what all the excitement was about. When Sarah's name was announced as the overall winner, the applause was thunderous and sustained. She had not just won a shooting competition, she had demonstrated that talent and determination could overcome deliberate sabotage and systematic discrimination. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, presented Sarah with her award and asked to speak with her privately after the ceremony. During their conversation, he questioned her about the discrepancy between her competition performance and her training scores. Sarah presented her carefully documented evidence of equipment tampering and sabotage, along with testimony from other women who had experienced similar problems. The colonel's reaction was swift and decisive. Within hours, Rodriguez, Chen, and several others identified in Sarah's investigation were called in for questioning. Faced with detailed evidence and multiple corroborating witnesses, they quickly admitted to the sabotage campaign. Their justification was that they were trying to maintain standards and protect limited opportunities for male Marines, but their actions were clearly violations of military law and regulations. The consequences for the saboteurs were severe and immediate. Rodriguez and Chen were discharged from the Marine Corps under less than honorable conditions, ending their military careers before they had properly begun. Several others received non-judicial punishment that included reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and restriction to base. 2 junior Marines who had participated in sabotaging other women's equipment faced court-martial proceedings. More importantly, the investigation revealed that the sabotage had been more widespread than even Sarah had realized. Over a dozen women across multiple training companies had been affected, and several had already been reassigned to non-combat roles or had left the Marines entirely because of artificially poor performance scores caused by equipment tampering. Colonel Martinez ordered a comprehensive review of all female Marines' training records and equipment issues. Several women who had been reassigned or had their advancement opportunities limited were given chances to requalify under proper conditions. The base also implemented new security procedures for weapons storage and training equipment to prevent future sabotage. Sarah's victory had implications that extended far beyond winning a shooting competition. She had exposed a systematic effort to undermine women in combat roles and had proven that the performance problems attributed to female Marines were often the result of deliberate interference rather than lack of ability. Her documentation and evidence gathering had been so thorough that it led to policy changes throughout the Marine Corps. The story of Sarah's triumph spread quickly throughout the military community and beyond. She became a symbol of perseverance in the face of discrimination and proof that talent would ultimately prevail over prejudice when given a fair chance. Military publications featured articles about her experience, and she was invited to speak at leadership conferences about overcoming adversity. For Sarah personally, the victory was both vindication and motivation. She had proven to herself and others that she belonged in the Marines and was capable of excelling in combat roles. Her confidence had been restored, and the months of struggle had actually made her a stronger and more determined Marine than she might have been otherwise. The other women who had been affected by the sabotage also benefited from Sarah's courage in exposing the truth. Several went on to successful careers in combat specialties, and the base saw a marked improvement in female Marines' performance once the systematic interference was eliminated. Sarah's willingness to fight back had protected not just her own career but the careers of women throughout the Marine Corps. As news of the competition results and subsequent investigations spread, Sarah realized that her story was bigger than just one person overcoming adversity. She had struck a blow against discrimination and proved that excellence could not be suppressed indefinitely. Her victory belonged not just to her, but to every woman who had been told she didn't belong in combat roles, and to every person who had faced systematic attempts to undermine their success. In the months following the competition, Sarah's life in the Marines transformed completely. The same drill instructors who had questioned her competence now used her as an example of Marine excellence. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had once made pointed comments about her weapon maintenance, became one of her strongest advocates and recommended her for advanced marksmanship training programs. Sarah's shooting performance had earned her recognition far beyond the base where the competition took place. Marine Corps headquarters took notice of her scores and the circumstances that had led to her breakthrough performance. She received orders to report to the Scout Sniper School at Camp Pendleton, an opportunity that would have seemed impossible just months earlier, when she was struggling with deliberately sabotaged equipment. The Advanced Marksmanship course was among the most challenging training programs in the Marine Corps, designed to produce the elite shooters who would serve as designated marksmen and scout snipers in combat units. The physical and mental demands were extreme, and the failure rate was high even among Marines who had been specifically selected for their shooting abilities. Sarah approached the advanced training with the same methodical preparation that had served her well during the competition. She studied ballistics, learned advanced techniques for reading environmental conditions, and practiced the mental discipline required for precision shooting under stress. The months of dealing with equipment sabotage had actually prepared her well for the unpredictable challenges of advanced training. Her instructors at Scout Sniper School were initially skeptical about training a female Marine, especially one who was still technically a recruit. However, Sarah's performance quickly silenced any doubts about her abilities. She consistently posted the highest scores in her class, demonstrated exceptional fieldcraft skills, and showed the mental toughness required for long-range precision shooting in combat conditions. The most demanding phase of Scout Sniper training involved stalking exercises, where students had to approach within 200 yards of instructors without being detected, then take precise shots from concealed positions. Sarah excelled at these exercises, using skills her grandfather had taught her during hunting trips to move silently through difficult terrain and remain hidden while shooting. During one particularly challenging exercise, Sarah's class was tasked with engaging targets at over 800 yards in gusty wind conditions that made accurate shooting extremely difficult. While most students struggled to hit their targets consistently, Sarah adapted her technique to account for the changing conditions and achieved a perfect score that impressed even her instructors. Word of Sarah's performance reached the highest levels of Marine Corps leadership. She was featured in training videos used to teach marksmanship to other Marines, and her story became part of the curriculum at leadership schools, as an example of how talent could overcome systematic discrimination. Military publications requested interviews, and she was invited to demonstrate shooting techniques at conferences and training events. The investigation that had resulted from Sarah's documentation of the sabotage also led to broader changes in how the Marine Corps addressed discrimination and harassment. New policies were implemented to protect all Marines from systematic interference with their training and advancement. Anonymous reporting systems were established to allow Marines to report discrimination without fear of retaliation. Colonel Martinez, who had initiated the investigation into the sabotage, was promoted and used Sarah's case as a model for addressing discrimination throughout the military. The policies developed at his base were adopted Corps-wide and helped create a more inclusive environment for all Marines regardless of gender, race, or background. Sarah's former saboteurs faced long-term consequences that extended beyond their immediate punishments. Rodriguez and Chen found it difficult to obtain employment after their dishonorable discharges, and their actions became a cautionary tale used in ethics training throughout the military. Their attempt to preserve opportunities for male Marines had actually resulted in stronger protections for women and minorities in combat roles. After completing Scout Sniper School with honors, Sarah was assigned to a reconnaissance unit, preparing for deployment to a combat zone. Her skills were put to immediate use as the unit's designated marksman, responsible for providing precision fire support and gathering intelligence through long-range observation. The same abilities that had been suppressed by months of sabotage were now protecting other Marines in actual combat situations. During her first deployment, Sarah's unit was involved in several operations where her marksmanship skills proved crucial. She successfully engaged enemy targets at distances exceeding 1,000 yards, provided overwatch for Marine patrols moving through dangerous terrain, and gathered intelligence through careful observation of enemy activities. Her performance in combat validated all the training and struggle that had led to that moment. The other women who had been affected by the sabotage campaign also went on to successful military careers. Several were reassigned to combat roles after requalifying under proper conditions, and they performed at levels that proved their original poor scores had been artificially created. Sarah's courage in exposing the truth had protected not just her own career, but the careers of dozens of other women. Sarah maintained contact with many of the women she had helped, providing mentorship and support as they advanced in their military careers. She established informal networks to help female Marines facing discrimination, and her story inspired others to document and report systematic attempts to undermine their performance. Years later, Sarah reflected on the lessons learned from her experience with equipment sabotage and the competition that had changed her life. The months of struggle had taught her that adversity could be transformed into strength if approached with the right mindset. The systematic attempts to undermine her performance had actually made her a better Marine by forcing her to develop exceptional technical skills and mental toughness. The grandfather who had taught her to shoot would have been proud to see how she had used his lessons not just to hit targets, but to overcome injustice and protect others facing similar challenges. His teachings about patience, precision, and perseverance had proven to be about more than marksmanship. They were life skills that applied to any challenge requiring determination and careful preparation. Sarah's story became part of Marine Corps legend told to new recruits as an example of how excellence would ultimately prevail over prejudice and discrimination. Her competition victory was remembered not just for the impressive shooting scores, but for the courage required to expose systematic sabotage and fight for the right to compete on equal terms. The 400 Marines who had witnessed her triumph at the competition had seen more than just exceptional marksmanship. They had witnessed the power of perseverance, the importance of documented evidence in fighting injustice, and the transformation that was possible when someone refused to accept unfair treatment. Sarah's victory belonged to everyone who believed in merit-based advancement and equal opportunity. In the end, the attempt to jam Sarah's rifle and undermine her military career had backfired completely. The saboteurs had intended to prove that women didn't belong in combat roles, but their actions had actually resulted in stronger protections for female Marines, and proof that systematic discrimination was the real barrier to women's success in the military. Sarah had turned their sabotage into her greatest triumph, outshot 400 Marines when given a fair chance, and established herself as one of the finest marksmen in the Corps. Her grandfather's lessons about shooting had prepared her for much more than hitting targets. They had prepared her to face any challenge with discipline, patience, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your true capabilities. When the tables were finally turned and the playing field was level, Sarah Martinez had shown everyone exactly what she was capable of accomplishing.